Hi, everyone. Welcome to our panel on licensing and pop culture and tabletop games. This is being presented as part of D4 Tabletop Creative Conference, the first ever D4, which is hosted by Comic-Con International and the Comic-Con Museum here in San Diego. My name is Pat Marino. I'm the game design manager at The Op, where we specialize in doing IP and pop culture games. And I'm joined by a whole host of awesome people who also have great experience in this area. And I'm going to let them each introduce themselves, and we'll start with Elisa.
Hey everyone, I'm Elisa Teague. I am the senior producer of role-playing games over at Renegade Game Studios. I've also been a game designer in the industry for a little over 20 years now, and I can't wait to talk about games and licenses with you all.
All right, Elisa, who should go next?
Jonathan.
All right, fine.
Since you spoke up.
Yes, fair enough. Hi, everybody. I'm Jonathan Ying. I'm a game designer. I've worked with a bunch of companies and a lot of IPs. I've worked with Renegade Games on Power Rangers Heroes the Grid. I've worked with Fantasy Flight Games on Doom and Star Wars Imperial Assault. And I've also done a couple independent projects like Bargain Quest up here.
I'm Jamie Boucher. I work at Roll20. I'm the marketplace manager there. And prior to working in virtual tabletop, I was working for several game publishers. Most recently, I was over at Mondo Games, and there I specialized in licensed jigsaw puzzles and board games, most notably the Unmatched series, which was co-published with Restoration Games, which pits all of your favorite characters from literature and mythology with some of our favorite IPs like Jurassic Park and Marvel and Buffy.
And so, Bruce Lee, my favorite character.
Well, I guess that just leaves me. I'm Chris Birch from Modiphius. I'm the founder, co-founder with my wife Rita, and now have the title of Chief Creative Officer. And I use a lot of my kind of skills in doing all our licensing deals.
There you go.
Awesome. So for our viewers who maybe aren't as familiar with this work, I'll kind of lay out a little intro of what this is all about. So licensed games is really working with a brand, right? And so whether that's a snack brand or Coca-Cola or something like that, all the way through Doom or Power Rangers, which were mentioned, Disney princesses, it's basically taking an intellectual property or IP that is owned by someone else and getting the legal rights to use it and integrate it into the tabletop experience. And so I figured I'd throw that out there in case people hear us saying like IP and they're going, what, like the address on my computer? Now, IP, intellectual property, is what we're going to be talking about in pop culture and games. And the first thing I always like to ask in a panel like this is, what is your favorite IP you've ever worked with? And what's that one on your bucket list that if, let's say the Op was looking for somebody to do a game on a certain IP, like what would be your dream ask, right, for us to come and present to you? And feel free, anybody, to jump in.
God, I do a lot of licensed games, so I do get this question a lot. I'm honestly running out of dream IPs. Like, I'm in this very blessed position that I've gotten to work on a lot of my favorite things. Like, I've gotten to work on Nicktoons, Star Wars, Power Rangers would have been my, Power Rangers was for a long time my thing. Like, oh man, if I could just get that IP, and I did, and that was great. So I think right now I'm kind of on the fence. I'd love to do something with Godzilla. Like, I've been a huge Godzilla fan since I was a child, and that would definitely be a bucket list. And recently I've gotten really into My Hero Academia, which I feel like could be a really good fit in tabletop. Yeah, I don't know. It's always something new. Whenever I watch something, I'm like, oh, what kind of cool board game could this make? Is always in the front of my mind whenever I devour a new piece of media.
I think I agree with Jonathan. I'm very fortunate. I've gotten to work with a lot of my favorites. I've gotten to work on Star Wars stuff. I've gotten to work on Marvel stuff, Disney. I do a lot of work with Dungeons and Dragons, which, is not, well, actually, it's starting to get to the Disney level, right? But definitely had a place in my heart for a really long time. And now I'm getting to work on all of my childhood favorites. Like I'm working on role-playing games for G.I. Joe and Transformers, which is a huge deal for me. So I definitely have those. I think my dream IPs, though, are always ones that I know the most information about. And I'm a pop culture collector as far as knowledge is concerned, obviously with my Game Geek Out. But the topics I know the most about are Star Wars, which I've gotten an opportunity for, but I would take more. And Buffy the Vampire Slayer for sure. And my absolute, well, I don't like to play favorites, but Legend of Zelda is like my absolute dream game to make.
Yeah, I think definitely working with Marvel was just such an experience for me, and getting to explore a lot of the characters that aren't traditionally featured in licensed properties. So getting to work with, Unbeatable Squirrel Girl and Ms. Marvel and Moon Knight, like my discovery of new characters that I hadn't really scratched the surface of that much yet. It was such a great experience for me. And it put me in a position to really get to celebrate them with other fans. And that's what it's all about. I think as far as properties that I haven't worked with yet that I would love to, Dune is like top of my list as far as just like a formative like license, something that really like is part of my being and that I can immerse myself in the most. That's right up there for me.
Great. I think that's important. I always think licenses, well, like any project you do, should be something you truly love, because you're going to end up doing it at 11 o'clock on a Saturday night or some weird hour of the day. You'll have to work on something. So it should really be something you care about. I think one of our big IPs, Star Trek, was a childhood dream. I remember sitting cross-legged in front of the TV watching Captain Kirk. And then later, good old Patrick Stewart using his Shakespearean English to direct the Enterprise. So I grew up with, both Star Wars and Star Trek. And I always liken Star Trek is like your best buddy who lives next door that you see every day. But Star Trek is the cool old uncle that turns up with a big bag of presents once a year. But they're both awesome. But Star Trek was the thing that I watched every single week. So, when we first started talking to CBS, and, I never thought we'd get it. But 3 years later, suddenly we get a contract. And I'm like, oh my gosh.
There it is.
So yeah, it was a real joy to work on that. And I don't know, stuff I'd love to work on, Lego, because Lego
everyone's like, oh yeah, that's a good one.
I remember once pouring out a pile of Lego minifigure parts in front of people and going, make your character, and they're just like, everyone's eyes lit up. And they wanted to they were creating stories out of weird shaped bits.
Someone on Pat's end agrees with you.
Yeah. So I think, that would be one of my, kind of ultimate dreams, but who knows? I think they've done, I think games are so far below them at the moment in terms of the market.
I mean, we'll see, right? Like, I think the lesson we've learned from all of this is that never say never, right? Like, I never would have thought I'd get a chance to, work with id Software on a Doom tabletop game, right?
Yeah. And you always think, I never see any deal as too big, because it's just a bunch of smaller problems to solve. So we went from Mutant Chronicles as our first license to Conan to Thunderbirds to Star Trek to Bethesda with all that, all the big properties. So everything's possible. You just never know. But then also maybe you don't want to work on your biggest dream, because actually you'd rather play it, and sometimes being too close to it is too much, because you end up doing it as a job. So
yeah, it's a great point. And there's definitely times, you mentioned like 3 years, right, in terms of a Star Trek deal. And I think sometimes people don't realize, from the initial outreach to a licensor about like, hey, we're interested in tabletop, it can be a very long and sometimes stressful and difficult process to figure out, is the opportunity there, and what are all the business deal terms and all of that kind of stuff. And sometimes when you love a thing, that's a tough experience to go through. And working internally at the ops, sometimes it's like we get really excited about something that we have on the hook for a while, and then it doesn't quite pan out, or you find out like the thing you want to do, you just can't do because of some rules or something else. And or there's times where I'm just like, boy, I want this. I just don't have the time. Like, can somebody else make this for me? And I'll just put it on my table later and play it. And, we get to work with a lot of IPs, many of which have been mentioned. Star Wars, we've done Marvel, we do Disney. Doing the Quest of Yore game recently with Pixar was a huge one, because we get to work with the actual creative team from the film and got to play the game with them and get their input. So that's always a rewarding experience. And worked with some other really, like Die Hard was just super fun to do, because it's Die Hard, right? And we were able to be a little tongue in cheek with it, but also like give it some respect as the action film it is, and kind of go that way. Spongebob was one of those where like I thought I knew the IP, and then like started getting into that like third and fourth tier of characters, and then you realize like all of those background characters in SpongeBob actually have stories and occupations and relationships and all this stuff that like isn't really talked about in the show, but is in the lore. So you're kind of like, oh, okay, like this is a deeper IP than I thought. For me, I had two dream ones that are now in process at the ops, so I can't talk about them. So that's been a big thing for me, is like we're doing the thing.
Big NDA,
yeah.
Such a tease.
I know, right? But ones I would say I share. Jamie Dune would be like a big one for me, and not just like the story of the core book and the film and stuff that's coming out. I want like the Butlerian Jihad, the first sort of 3 books in the timeline, and that whole story is like built for games. And I would love to dive into that, and then
I would play the hell out of that.
Right, like that'd be a great one. And then I'm trying to think. There's always ones that I'm like pushing that we should go after, but they're complicated. Gundam would probably make that list for me. Like, I want a minis game with giant fighting robots and the whole thing. But
okay, but like which Gundam, right? There's like so many good, like so many series at this point.
a giant Kickstarter with just add-ons for every series.
God. Don't even. The most dangerous wish.
Yeah. $500 later, and you've got it all.
Yeah. Oh man.
All right. So something I wanted to talk about, and we've touched on all these IPs from across, like, you've got throwbacks to early like Star Trek all the way up to things that are happening now and coming out. What do you see as some of the trends and recent developments in IP or pop culture based games for the tabletop industry, and sort of what's your prediction on where things are going to go from here?
I think that there's a lot of trend. I mean, there always has been the trend of nostalgia, right? Everybody wants to pick up on nostalgia. And the nice thing about that trend is that it's ever evolving. So as each block of like decades go by, unfortunately, going by way too quick, there's a new there's a new revelation of all of these IPs that are out there. That's like, oh yeah, those people who were children when those things were popular, whether it's cartoons on television or movies that came out or books that came out, are now adults, have their own income, have their own, disposable money to spend on things, and have their own children that they want to introduce to those brands. And so not only are they going back and showing the original media, but there's a great opportunity to bring those things to the table. And so you're seeing a lot of things that you were a fan of when you were a child coming out now. And I think that's a great thing to capture for the tabletop market.
Yeah.
I think also, in addition to like the nostalgic reach back, the media that's coming out today has so much more being put into it from a production effort, and the stories are so rich and the characters are so developed that it's really engaging the fans in a way that makes them want more and makes them want to be part of that world and really experience, beyond that season or beyond that couple of hours. And so I think as the content that's being generated in the entertainment industry continues on that trend of just like really impacting its viewers more, you're seeing a lot more opportunities in gaming to then say, okay, you want to be in this adventure? Like, this is something we can maybe do.
I think that's actually a really good point that I hadn't initially considered, but as we've gone into kind of this more modern age of nerd culture, and like, we have wiki articles and we have all of these ways of looking up this deep information for these stories, players have started wanting deeper explorations of them in their games, right? Like way back when Marvel comics are like really literally whatever comics are out right now, and you don't get the full backstories or stuff. It's much harder to look into the characters' histories or to see all of the possible content. Games tended to be much more surface level, right? Like the old school Power Rangers board games were very simple, like dice rolling affairs, like very aimed at the youngest possible audience. And like early Star Wars games are like, hey, it's Monopoly. It's like, I think I played I played like the first Battlestar Galactica game that was just like a roll and move game that you could like shoot a laser and kill another player, and that was like the entire game. And if you compare that to like the more recent Battlestar Galactica game that really dives into like the themes of like the politics and the stress and mistrust and survival elements, it is like players have a much higher expectation of what they want in their licensed titles rather than just seeing the cool art assets or the name on the box, right?
Yeah. I think on a business level, because tabletop games, say when I started licensing 8 years ago, it was pretty new for a lot of the brands that we were talking to. I mean, licensed games have been around for 20-30 years, and if you look back at like the early James Bond role-playing game, is a good example of one of the first licensed products. But I think what you're going to start to see, there's a lot of money slushing around tabletop is becoming way more popular and on a business radar. And so those cheap deals that we were all getting in the last few years might not be there anymore. I mean, if you license in music licensing can be 16 to 18 to 25% of your net receipts, and typically in tabletop, you might be looking at 8, 10, 12% of your royalties. So I have a feeling that a lot of those big companies are the big companies do tend to charge more anyway, but I think a lot of the companies are going to start saying, actually, we want a slice of this really successful market, and it's going to be harder and harder to pick up the big rights for a fair deal. I think also, think about this. If you'd said even 5 years ago, one day there's going to be a Marvel TV show on a Friday night, a Star Wars TV show on a Friday night. There's going to be like half a dozen other big science fantasy adventure shows on this thing called Netflix that and then there's going to be Disney and blah, blah, blah. You would have been like, nah, it's never going to happen. But so we've got so much choice in all this, like, action adventure geek IPs that could make great games. But for us as creator, designer, publishers, like, is there enough of a market there? Of course, like Star Wars and Marvel, yes, but all these other IPs that are being created that are so cool, have they got enough of a market? So if you go back 5 years, the big geek IPs were big central pillars of geekdom that had massive followings around them. And now we've got lots and lots and lots of little pillars which is great for smaller companies that want to get started because it's easier for them to get into. But I think it's going to get harder to grab, harder for companies to make money out of a good license because that audience is getting more and more fractured.
Yeah, you're seeing a lot of overlap too, because you'll see the same IPs, coming out with multiple games, sometimes very close to each other. And we're fortunate that the expectations, I think, from the fans, from the players, have evolved as far as licensed games go. A licensed game today is far different from what it might have been 10 years ago, 20 years ago. And so as those expectations have risen on the player side, it's really empowered the creators to then go and make sure that their experience isn't necessarily what you would immediately expect, and it's unique and it's different. So if two games come out with the same property, they're totally wildly different, and there's merit to owning both, to playing both, and to experiencing both, which is really cool.
Mm.
Yeah, there's definitely that increase in expectations because the board game fandom or the tabletop fandom has grown. But I also think, as was mentioned, like Netflix and all these other ways have found more ways to reach fans with those AAA titles. So Marvel is everywhere, Star Wars is everywhere, and there's more opportunity and expectation from those IP holders that, while tabletop is a big industry, one game isn't enough anymore to put out per year. Where once upon a time that was like, well, that's sort of that audience, and they've had one film in the last 5 years, so like one game will cut it. And now it's like, oh no, there's all this new content to explore, and the throwback content. But then you have, as sort of what Jonathan mentioned, is the depth, right? Like, because of streaming, because of internet, because of all these other ways, we're exploring our fandoms on a much deeper level. And so there's sort of a choice for publishers: is do we go after the big giant AAA title that probably a lot of people are going after, and it's got that ever increasing royalty percentage? Or do you use the fact that we can target fans through some of these like internet opportunities and take that more niche fandom and really do a deep dive for those fans and do the big Kickstarter thing to say like, hey, underserved audience for this thing, we are doing the thing you've always wanted, and we're going to just do it to the nines with all the miniatures and everything else on Kickstarter. And that's going to be the only game for that IP because maybe it's overlooked by other people. And I see opportunity in both, but it's hard, sort of to Chris's point, to decide where's the money, right? Like at the end of the day, we can make really cool stuff and we can probably get it into the hands of fans, but can we do it based on the royalty and the number of fans and how we market to them in a way that sort of has a return on investment for the company so that we can keep making games in the future?
Yeah, I think the underserved audience point is a really good one. And what those bigger IPs like Disney and Marvel and the rest are proving is that there are so many stories to be told beyond the main characters, right? So you never would have thought many years ago that there would be more stories for Star Wars like what we're getting now, right? But I was playing in a Star Wars role-playing campaign. I had a campaign that lasted almost 4 years. And we always sat around the table saying, oh man, our story would make the best like TV show or the best movie. But they weren't making other stories that were in the universe, right? It was always just the Skywalker, saga, and that was it. And so now we're getting those, and it's a proof of concept to everybody that those side stories, the universe itself is a playground, and there's so much opportunity to create. And when we were talking about trends, which I think is where this started, one thing that popped into my head also is that the trend of role-playing is huge, and not just for role-playing games. I know I'm biased because I primarily now make role-playing games, but I have a huge tabletop like board game background. And inserting role-playing ability into board games is a huge trend right now. You're seeing a lot more storytelling, a lot more than this, roll and move stuff that of the past. And I think that is really big because people want to feel like they're a part of it. People want to feel like they are in that universe. They don't want to necessarily just like plop down a card with a picture of a character on it. They want to feel like they're doing the thing. And I think games nowadays are trending towards allowing people to feel like they are inside that playground, not just looking, at a screen.
Yeah, there was a big reason why in Star Wars Imperial Assault, we made an active choice not to have the players controlling Luke Skywalker and Han Solo and, all these other characters, because they're really tied down by the canon of the movies and the canon of the stories that already exist. We are using tabletop to tell new stories with these new characters that the players get to decide, like, oh, does this character get to like accomplish their goals, or do they have a more difficult time? Who are their friends? Who are their allies? Like those types of decisions, putting those up to the players becomes really interesting. And speaking of like a licensing thing, there are some games that are okay with you fussing with the main story, right? Like for the Battlestar Galactica game, certain characters die, any character can die, even ones that don't die in the show. In our Star Wars game, like there was a point where we got a note from Lucasfilm that it was like, hey, Luke Skywalker and Darth Vader can't ever meet in any context that they didn't meet in the movies, right? Because they don't. And so that there were situations where like, all right, so we have to make sure that our plot accounts for this. And we had to kind of do a few caveats because there are situations where you can bring Luke as an ally in a mission that Vader appears in, and that ended up having to be okay. But like there are these restrictions on these existing properties that you'll often have to work around when developing licensed games.
Yeah, it's interesting actually, because different IPs, different brand owners have different attitudes to that. So for example, in your case, Lucasfilm, very controlling. Bethesda's another good example of, we cannot make up a vault number because they might use that number in the future for a video game, and they can't know now what they might do. They just don't want to be painted into a corner. So when we create scenarios for the Fallout Miniatures game, it's, you know, there's a Vault Tech factory somewhere in the wasteland that you're about to explore. We don't put it on a map anywhere. But whereas with Star Trek, they really embrace content, because of course they've got their you know, alpha and beta, or you know, prime content and beta content, which is kind of anything not in the movies and the TV shows. So they gave us a whole area of space, which was amazing, which we called the Shackleton Expanse, and we created this whole area. And you know, we were making up miniatures with guns that don't exist in the shows because we needed a guy with a bigger gun, and we were making up, you know, new space stations and new storylines, and they love you adding to the canon, and they really encourage you to. So it's interesting how, and that's a massive global international brand, you know, and yet other brands are like, no, don't, this is you're on railway tracks, don't go outside the railway tracks, you can go forward or back, but don't go anywhere else, you know.
Yeah,
I think that's a really good point, and it influences kind of the buckets of licensed games that you see coming out. You know, there are some that allow you to really honor the source material and relive, you know, some of your favorite moments, some of your favorite scenes in the point of view of your favorite characters. But then there are others where you go completely off script, and it's amazing. And, you know, one of the things that we really got to play with the most when I was at Mondo was coming up with new art to honor, you know, these existing properties, and getting to reimagine and give people something that hasn't existed yet. And so I think, you know, between those two, you're really gonna find something for everyone in someone that's looking to honor this IP that they love, and it's so fun.
Oh man, the aesthetic style of Unmatched is unparalleled, really. It's just so good.
So kind of where we've been going with this conversation is getting into the next question I was going to ask or pose to the group, which is sort of the process you have for, you know, embarking on a new IP design or new IP that you want to work with. So I know for us at the op, we've got all the businessy stuff, right, that has to happen to figure out what the royalties are and sort of if it's a viable deal for us. And sometimes the answer to that is no, which can be soul crushing. Like, oh, this thing I love, we're going to do it. And then they come back with like, you know, well, you know, we typically do a 28% royalty. And you're like, in what universe? Oh, okay, we're just moving on.
That's a shame.
Yeah. But then there's the, like, we like sort of try to see where those boundaries are. So we were touching sort of on like what you can and can't do with an IP and where the canon is. And it's very different for licensors as was addressed. And, you know, there's always for us like that, let's tee up this thing that is probably going to break a lot of rules, right? Like it's custom art and the characters do things they never did on screen or in the books or whatever. And we'll see how they react, right? And sometimes it's a shocking, like, okay. And we're like, wait, really? You know? And so like one of the ones that sticks out to me is the Coded Chronicles series that we have at the op, which is like our escape room series. And it really requires narrative shift, right? Like if you watch The Shining, at no point do the characters stop and solve escape room style puzzles in the film, right? They're not just like, oh, in order to escape Jack from this scene, we need to figure out this weird puzzle on the wall. But for that game to work, it had to do that. And we were concerned, like, you know, we had to go through the studio, we had to go through the Kubrick estate. Was there going to be like this barrier of like, that's not how it was? And sort of every step of the way, they're like, no, that's fine. That's fine. But then you hit these really weird roadblocks of like, oh, the carpet, you want to use that pattern? You can only do it if you follow these 7 rules. And you're like, what? You know, because sometimes you see those things everywhere and then you're like, oh, but none of those things are actually licensed, and it's people doing sketchy things with that kind of design style or whatever. So, for all of you, sort of what process do you take when you're embarking on a new IP, and what surprises or challenges maybe have you found along the way?
Oh, man, it definitely, every IP I've ever worked on has had a completely different, like the license holder has a completely different system of how they handle it. But before I dive into that, I do want to make one note that you had mentioned about royalties, that as a designer, it was interesting to realize that, as a designer, I will often try and negotiate a royalty cut for games I design. When working with licensors, I often will be forced to take a lower percentage royalty because some of that royalty is already occupied by the existing IP. So first thing I almost always do is just look at the profit margin I can afford to live on, and see if it's going to be worth it. Like, okay, do I think this game will do well enough that the popularity of this IP will make up for the lost profits in the royalties, as opposed to something where we don't have to pay, the company won't have to pay extra for the license. And usually the answer is yes. But it is really interesting because when we worked with Saban on Heroes of the Grid, this was before the Hasbro changeover. Saban had a whole system called Ranger School, where they had a big PowerPoint presentation of here are the rules for the Power Ranger setting. Here are the themes we hit, and Rangers don't fight each other. Rangers eat healthy and exercise, and it's all these really fundamental traits of what makes a Power Ranger, which was super helpful. Which is very different from how other companies I've worked with don't tell you what's wrong until you get it wrong, and then they're like, oh no, you so we'll pay a bunch of money and have this art piece. It's here's our cover, and they're like, nope, change it. We're not allowed to do this or that, and that can be a big stressor when you don't know, or you have to deal with waiting for licensor approval. Is any licensed game takes twice as long as a non-licensed game, because you have to factor in however many weeks you wait for their licensor to approve whatever projects you have. But God, I'm sorry, I'm rambling. To get on process, I do think it's really important that whatever license you work with, you make a decision about whether you are the kind of fan who is interested in this, right? I try and make it a point to, I've gotten several licenses offered to me, several game projects that are oh man, this is a very popular IP, or this is a very cool IP. And I'm but I don't personally really care that much about it. And I don't think, and as cool and exciting that would be, as good for that would be for my reputation, I'm not a fan, and I think people will be able to tell, and I am not the person who should be designing that thing. So kind of knowing where, knowing what IPs really speak to you and that you can bring that amount of energy and excitement towards is really important to deciding what projects to work on, I feel.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point. Something, being a full-time designer at a company that has a slate of games that we're making, we have that challenge sometimes. Is we know as a business opportunity this game is a good thing and we're going to make it, but of the 3 full-time designers on staff, none of us love the thing. And sometimes we'll reach out, like we did with Kingdom Hearts Talisman, to Elisa and say you love this thing, none of us have time to play all these games all the way through and learn to love them, help. And sometimes, especially when we do our Hasbro co-brands, the Monopolies and stuff, it's sort of well, I guess my weekend is going to be spent learning to love this IP and diving into the content and the wikis. And because, you're right, Jonathan, when you're making something for fans, you can't kind of slap it together. I think once upon a time, that was very true of IP games, is yeah, just close enough is close enough. And people will buy it because it's what's out there. But the demand now is so much higher that, people will post online and pick holes in things and kind of point that out. So, you've got to please the licensor and their rules, but you have to please the fan too, and make something that people really want and are going to be excited to own, as opposed to yeah, okay, it's those characters and they're on the box, but past that, it doesn't really make any sense.
And people can tell your passion as well. So if you're doing a project and you're talking about it, they can tell whether you love it. And that's why I always try and work on something that I love from the ground up, even if I don't end up actually designing I mean, because I don't, design the games day to day anymore, but I'm going to be talking about it on interviews, and I'll have had some involvement, and I want to feel like I care about it, and because that comes across in the interview always. And if you don't care, if it was just a money thing, then people can tell that. And I've passed on one big license that would have transformed the company, because I saw 5 years ahead of, we would have to just change so much of the company for that license. And I just didn't love it, and I knew other people would love it so much. And also there's the opportunity cost. If you take on that big license, and then the next 2 months later, you get offered something really cool that you really love. You're like, oh God, but we'd have to take on loads more people, and we're not ready, we don't have the money, and we've just taken on this thing. And that's always a problem. So I think really truly caring about something, and I'll do stuff that's smaller, that's maybe not even really commercial, because I love it. Because I could be making a load more money working for a bank or something. The reason we're all doing this is because we love this, right?
Yeah.
We care about whatever the thing is we're making. And so why work on something? Why spend hours and hours on something that you just really don't care about? I mean, I remember someone telling me, I used to manage bands, and this artist said, like, Chris, there's 6 things you can do really well, but there's only one you'll starve for, because you love it so much, and you won't care what money you make. And that's why I've always gone with that. And I think, through to all these deals that we do, it's got to be something that, you'll go without dinner because I've got to get this next idea down. It's so good,
Yeah, I will say, Chris, like we do have a bit of a luxury when it comes to being able to pick our own projects. Because like I remember, working at Fantasy Flight, like I was very thankful that they did take into account, my own tastes. But there are times when it's like, hey, we need a game for this IP or this project, and like you gotta become a fan of it, right? Instead of one that you kind of preloaded, which was its own challenge.
Well, I guess, people who work for us, I can't always promise that they love what I go, hey guys, we've just signed this deal. You've got to make a game based on this. I do try and sign stuff I think is going to be fun for everyone. And I, try and find people in the business who care about it, as opposed to like, I just hate Fallout. Last thing I want to do is do a Fallout game.
But this is how you get people to watch the movies you want them to watch. It's like, I keep telling you to watch this. Now you have to.
Exactly. Yeah. I wasn't wanting you to go and watch the Lego movie or whatever, But I think, it's, at the end of the day, when I started, I did my own world, Acting Cthulhu, and then we got offered Mutant Chronicles. And it was, it was a dead universe that had a movie, and it was kind of a mutant and a Games Workshop competitor. And it was an easy deal to get because I knew them, and I'd liked the game. I'd played one of the board games back in the 90s, but I was like, this is an opportunity. I'm going to do this. And I haven't read any of it in years, but I remember it. And so I became a fan because it was a good opportunity to get our name in the door. And that was our very first little license, which I always tell people, like, if you want to get on that licensing thing, you've got to start with something really small that's easy to get, that isn't an expensive thing, and then you get the next one and the next one. So,
and once people know that you can do it well, like you're off to the races.
Yeah, because when I went for the Fallout deal, I was like, hey, look at our Star Trek stuff we just done. So now you're trading up every time. So
I just love that we're on here like complaining about these jobs where we have to watch movies over the weekend or playing games, and like everyone watching is going to be like, get out of here.
Well, I was going to say, like, it's not even just a matter of being a fan of the thing. Once you are already the fan of the thing, then you need to do a super deep dive, even if you've, watched things, 100 times. Like I was, this is one of my little claim to fame, is that I was once cast as the Buffy geek on a TV show called Beat the Geeks. That episode never aired because the show got canceled, which is sad for me, but I pride myself in having like knowledge, like deep knowledge. I've watched the show, well over 100 times all the way through, like well over. It's like my touchstone show, right? But if I were to do a game, I would be rewatching everything and taking meticulous notes. There's an IP that I can't talk about that I'm working on right now for a role-playing game. and I had watched The Thing quite a few times, and I know all about The Thing, right? But since starting
Oh man, The
I
Thing.
have
Yeah,
now,
it's a great
now
movie.
watched it an additional 25 times all the way through. I'm not even kidding, in just a matter of a few months, because I'm constantly finding things, getting ideas. I mean, you just need to do that deep, deep dive to provide for the fans.
It does change the way you view the media that you are working on. That's definitely true. I mean, I worked on the Game of Thrones trivia game, and watching Game of Thrones, looking for the most trivial stuff to reference in the game, because we had to like write like 800 questions based specifically on the show. We couldn't use the books in the Game of Thrones trivia game. So like when it every time someone was like, "Ah, yes, I need like 14 soldiers to go on this thing," it's like, "Oh yeah, 14 soldiers. How many soldiers did you need to do that?" Like, it really does affect how you consume media when you're working on it, which is definitely something that you don't think about when you first pick up the license.
You bring up a really interesting topic, but I know that like we're going to soon run out of time, because we could probably all talk about this for days.
Yeah.
But you said you couldn't use the books, you're only using the show, and there is a huge difference that I think fans out there don't really realize, that there is a big difference between a book license and a TV film license, and what you can do, what you can't do, what material you can use, what imagery, everything. And they work very differently. And it is a challenge and a gift, depending on which way you're going.
That's right. And sometimes actually it's better to work on the book license, because you've got a lot more content than a TV show. And you've got a lot more freedom, because things don't have to look a certain way.
We had to do actor license stuff, right? Like, which is another thing. Like, actors' licenses are, human beings are something that you have to, have the rights to show their pictures in your game. Or like, HBO and a lot of their contracts, like they can't be cropped out of screen grabs occasionally, right? Like that's part of their contract. So it changes what you can do. Whereas in like a game with illustrated artwork, just draw the cool pictures and it's fine.
Yeah, that's definitely a trade-off. Is the shows often come with a style guide, right? Like there's art and imagery ready to go, but it's probably not everything you want for the game. Or as you said, like Game of Thrones chess for us, right? Like all of those pieces are sculpted to look like the actors or actresses who play the roles, and many of them had their own approvals process. So it's like, okay, we've got X% of the pieces approved, but we're still waiting on this actress and this actor to come back to us and say, that well, no, my nose isn't quite how I want it, or whatever it may be. The flip side though is you go books and you have maybe cover art and everything else has to be custom illustrated, and good custom illustration isn't cheap, and it takes time. And if you're suddenly saying like, we're doing a deck builder, we need 400 cards of custom art, and it's like,
and I think that's something too, the cost of creating licensed games, in addition to the high royalty fees, all of the art, everything that goes into it, it's hard to gauge when you're beginning a process to start a project like this. Like, can you afford to do it? Like, are these fans fan enough to pay the extra price that it takes sometimes to create like a premium licensed product? Because, if you love something so much as the creators, like, you don't want to put it out with like the cheapest components you can find either. You want to make it premium. And so then your costs are going up there, your costs are going up with the art, your costs are going up with the royalties. And so that's one of the things when deciding whether or not we can do a license that I always look at is, can we do it right? Not just can we do it, but like, can we afford to do it right? And will people pay for that and respect that and appreciate that?
Yeah. And it's also knowing, like, even having a cool license and knowing that there's a big audience, making the game for that audience is a big consideration, right? Like, if I were making like a Spongebob game, I don't want to make it an 8-hour Twilight Imperium alike, right? Like, as kind of awesome as like the idea of that would be, right? Like, the majority of that fandom is probably not interested in, diving into something like a super heavy Euro or something. And so knowing like, if you are making a license for an audience, knowing the kind of game that audience is interested in is a big part of, deciding what kind of design process to go with. Featuring the particular elements of the world. There are a couple of IPs that I know that there are several games that are out right now that I know used to be licensed, and they actually removed the IP elements from it because they were like, the IP isn't really going to be worth like the cost of royalties and all these things, because that audience really won't care that much about this particular game style. So we could just court the people who like that kind of game rather than trying to get that audience into that kind of game. And that kind of decision making is a big part of gets factored into these kinds of decisions.
So that actually leads into a good sort of final question I'll pose to the group, which is, if somebody's at home watching this panel and they're watching it because they're thinking, I want to get into IP and licensed games, what's your like sort of snapshot advice that you would give those folks? And mine is kind of based on what Jonathan just said, which is if you're a game designer and you want to design a game for your favorite IP, first know if someone already has those rights and if they're taking submissions. And if you still want to pursue it, design in a way that you can pivot, right? So we have people bring us Harry Potter concepts all the time that just aren't right because they break too many rules or they just aren't what we're looking for as a company. And they kind of run out of options quick after us as far as companies who have the rights to do Harry Potter. And if you put 3 years into designing that game and you can't put a new theme on it, that's 3 years of probably a lot of fun you had, but that isn't going to see retail shelves. So that's always my advice, is if you're going to design authentic to the IP, but be prepared to pivot if it's just not an option.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think Chris gave a really good piece of advice earlier, honestly, about like if you have a chance to get like a low cost or like a smaller IP that is like, Marvel is a hard IP to get, and like, designing, like trying to design the next big Spider-Man game is a pretty tall ask. But there are a lot of licenses, a lot of superheroes, and a lot of stories that don't have that kind of high profile attention, that still have a deep and affectionate fan base who would love to see a game for it. And like that might be a better way in, because also a lot of those license holders don't see a lot of offers from publishers or designers, and so they might be more interested in working with people on that front. So I feel bad kind of piggybacking on Chris's answer for mine, but I'm gonna do it.
I guess from my side is that I'm talking as a publisher, not a designer, that if you're going after a license, you need to be serious when you go and talk to them. Don't go in going, well, we can give you $500, So, and don't go in saying it only works if it's a Kickstarter, because a lot of companies don't want to see their brands on Kickstarter. If it's like, we're going to do it, Kickstarter is a great platform for pre-orders. We'd like to use it because it's, the industry is using it a lot as marketing now. That's great. But, if you remember, when you go to a brand, they've got to, is it going to be worth it for them to do all the paperwork and the contracts? Got to get their legal people, if it's a bigger company, involved. And so you've got to really think about your forecast and how much money you're going to make them, and be quite serious about that, but not crazy. Don't give away the farm. Start low, but serious. And, and if you can get a small brand, and also make sure you've got something to show them. Look, we made this awesome looking game. Look at this beautiful book we made. Imagine Dune on that, or imagine Mutant Chronicles on that, or Star Trek. And we can do a great job and show how much you are authentic as well. And I think authenticity is a really key thing in licensing, because they're giving you their baby to hold, and they want to know that you care about it, that you, as Elisa said, that you've researched it really, really well, that their brand, that you're not going to put Starfleet characters in power armor that looks like ancient knights armor because it looks really cool, that you're going to stick to the brand, and also be professional, that you've got a way of getting that product made into the markets and promoted.
I think that to hop onto what Chris is saying, is managing expectations as a game designer. At least if you own a game company and you have lots of products under your belt and the money to invest and everything, it's great to go after these IPs, right? But if you're a game designer, It's better to take the approach of going to a company that already has the ability, that either already has the license for the IP that you want or has the ability to get it. Because what a lot of people don't know is they'll make a game specifically for an IP, and then they want to go after it, and they don't realize that it's not even just upfront fees for the license plus the royalties. It's not just being able to invest, tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars into the production and getting all of the art together and hiring writers and everything else you need to do. But it's also, you need to carry insurance for most of these companies, millions and millions of dollars of insurance. There's so much other stuff that you need to have established before you go in. And for a long time, I was consulting game designers in the industry and helping them out. And I would have people approach me with pitches of ideas. They're like, yes, I have this Harry Potter game. And I'm like, well, have you talked to that? Have you talked to the op? Have you talked, and
do you
like,
have
no,
Harry Potter though?
Make it, I just want to make it. I want to get the license. And they don't realize how much has already been established. Certain licenses are assigned out to various game companies in different ways, whether it's the entire tabletop, at one company has all of tabletop. Sometimes just people have, just card games, board games, role-playing games. Different licenses are done different ways, and you have to really know a lot about the industry before you just say, I'm going to dedicate years and years of my time to making this one thing that I'll never be able to get on the market. And it's hard to say that, but it's the truth.
Yeah, I think you guys have covered most of it. In addition to like everything Elisa just said too, with each license, there are also a bunch of restrictions as to like what channels you can sell your product through, what countries you can distribute your product to. And so I think the most important thing before starting a project is really having so many frank conversations and establishing expectations and knowing exactly what you can do, what you can't do. And that goes deep into even the content and the development of the game. It goes into aesthetics. It's just, you don't want to start something only to learn that like your vision, what you really dreamed about making isn't a possibility, because at that point you're in. And so really just preparation. You have to know exactly what you're getting into before you commit to anything.
Yeah, and one of the things I always think about is like you see those comments on Board Game Geek and places like, why have they never done this game, or they did this game, but why do they never do it this way? It's like, there's probably a reason, and that reason isn't they just didn't think of it, right? Like if there's never been a
They
game
hate
for
money.
yeah, there's this major IP that's never had a game. There's probably a reason why that IP holder just isn't ready for tabletop, and I'm sure someone has tried, right? So to kind of then conclude, we'll do the plugs, for where people can find you, anything you want to share that you've been working on. I'll kick it off. You can find me on Instagram and Twitter. It's at Dr. Pat Makes Games. And then you can find the latest news about what we're working on at theop.games. And I guess the plug of the moment is Quests of Yours, about to hit retail this month, which is our intro to RPG based in the Pixar Onward film.
Nice. Sure, I'll go. I'm Jonathan Ying, and you can find me on Twitter at FancyMancer, or you can find me on the Power Rangers Heroes of the Grid fan page on Facebook, where I'm often answering questions and hanging out with fans of the Power Rangers Heroes of the Grid game. I think we've got a Kickstarter coming up in the next month or so. I don't know. I'm actually not sure when this goes up, so it might have already happened. Yeah, that's me.
All right, I'll go. I'm Elisa Teague. You can find me on Twitter and the like at Geeky Pinup, and you can see all of the cool things I am working on for Renegade at renegadegamestudios.com. Some of the stuff that we have coming to you very soon, if not already. And we're doing a brand new line of 5th edition Vampire the Masquerade books with all new titles coming out this year and next year and forever, hopefully. And I also have the Power Rangers role-playing game, G-Show role-playing game, and Transformers role-playing games that are all coming out this fall of 2021, and the My Little Pony role-playing game coming out next year. plus more I'm not allowed to talk about, but stay tuned. And if you follow me, you'll hear lots about it, I promise.
Shall I go? Okay.
Yeah, go for it, Chris. I'll go last.
So I'm Chris Birch from Modiphius. You can find us at /Modiphius or at Modiphius on Twitter, / on Facebook and Instagram and YouTube. And find out more about our projects. The big things we've got coming out is the June role-playing game at the end of June. And the Fallout role-playing game, 2D20 role-playing game, is also coming out in June. And then we've got the Skyrim board game that we just recently announced, which is very exciting, which is coming out where it's going to GameFound in the summer. So there'll be lots more revealed about that and all sorts of more projects.
Awesome.
All right. You can find me on LinkedIn just by looking at my name, which is here on my tile. So find me there. And then if you want to see everything that's going on with Roll20, you can go to roll20.net or on Twitter, Instagram at Roll20app.
Awesome. So that's going to wrap up our panel. Thank you, everyone, for making the time to be here and share your wisdom with our viewers. And until the next one, we'll see you later.
Yeah. Cheers.
Thanks all.